Now, yeah, sick. All right, we are ready to begin. All right, welcome to Microeconomics. This is the review session hosted by the IBO Discord. This is hosted by me, JP. So the plan for today is to go through most of microeconomics. We will not do the higher level theory of the firm stuff because I've decided to move that to Thursday, which is the April 18th, and this will be at 1400 GMT. On Tuesday we'll go through the macro, and on Wednesday we'll go through international economics. All right, people have begun to join, so I guess we'll just start. So this all begins with the foundation of economics, which is centered around the idea of scarcity, which is that there are unlimited wants and limited fulfillment. This is symbolized with a PPC curve, or production possibilities curve. As you can see here, you can see that you have schools on the y-axis and motor cars on the x-axis, which shows that you can either produce schools or cars. This is very simplified, but it shows the concept. So since the reason for the graph here being curved is that you can never make full amount of schools or full amount of cars. That's just not possible because you have a limited fulfillment or a limited factors of productions that you can use. So we talk about factors of production, which is what's used to make these things, from schools or cars. So a change in any of these or an increase in any of these may either cause you to move inside here, a movement from B to W, or it could cause a shift if the improvement is large enough. There's a reverberation. What the fuck? Yeah, one sec. Check that. There shouldn't be a reverb. No, that's just probably my room being a fucking echo center. Yeah, so a change in any of these could cause the PPC to shift, which is natural resources, which is such as land or oil, for example. Labor, that's all human input. Oh, there is echo. What the fuck? Oh, I know, it's my headset being shit. One sec. Yeah, I'll try to fix it. Now you can hear me. This is great. Okay. Start recording again. Yeah. Okay. Okay, next slide. So the fundamental questions of economics is what to produce, how much to produce, or for whom, not from, for whom to produce. And then this is sort of a philosophical answer. Who has the answer? The government, the market, or both? And the IB economics takes the stance of a mixed market economy, which is where the government and the market decides what to produce. So a definition you have to know here is that market, this is where potential buyers and potential sellers meet. So the market is run by market forces, demand and supply, or as Adam Smith called it, the invisible hand of the market. And also the government, which I guess you could say they exist to fix the inefficiencies, which we'll talk about in the end. So demand, that's the willingness and ability for customers to pay a certain price in the market to obtain a good or service. This is represented by a downward sloping curve, as you can see here. This is due to the wealth effect, which is that when you have a lot of money, then spending a low amount, or when something costs so little as $0.50, then you can buy a lot of it because you feel richer. While if it's $2, then you're like, oh, this is kind of expensive, I might not buy that much. And the principle of marginal returns, which says that, for example, when you're eating ice cream, the first spoon of ice cream tastes really good, but a 10th maybe not as much. And this is the same for here buying soft drinks. And then you have the substitution effect, which is that when something becomes expensive here at $2, then people might instead just run over to the Pepsi shop and get some Pepsi instead of buying Coke, since Pepsi might cost $0.50. If you take higher level, you should know that the quantity demanded is supported by this function. A is just the price at zero demand. It's not shown here, but it should cross this curve when you draw it on the exams. And B is unconstant. It's simple algebra. Yes, this will be recorded. And the law of demand states that there's an inverse relationship between the price of a good and quantity demanded of said good. Yeah. And so something can cause shifts in demand, which is when demand curve shifts in or out. This is caused by the non-price determinants of demand, which is the public perception of a good. For example, certain goods may shift in and out of fashion, thereby causing fluctuations in demand, or here's and shifts in demand. For example, nowadays people wearing 80s clothes, they're really popular now, but in 10 years people start wearing, I don't know, some fancy ass sweatpants and not 80s clothes anymore. So then the demand for 80s clothes might shift inside. Of course, you have the old classic vaccines cause autism. So for example, when people start saying, oh no, vaccine causes autism, then the demand for vaccines might shift inwards because people think, okay, I'm not gonna buy these vaccines. I don't want my kids to have autism. It also changes with income. That's like the income for the whole economy. So say if all people earned $5,000 more per year, they will spend more money because they feel richer, and this would cause a shift outwards in demand. Same with substitutes, which also relates to the cross-price elasticity of demand. For example, if Coke costs 0.2 euros less than Pepsi, then you're probably going to buy Coke and not Pepsi because it's cheaper and it has almost the same taste, although this is a hotly debated topic. And also, if the good has any close complements, for example, if McDonald's has a $1 burger deal, then you're probably going to go in there and you're going to buy a whole ass menu with chips and a drink, which would shift the demand out for example, chips and drinks. Then we have supply. Supply is the willingness and ability of firms to produce a good or a service at a given price. This is shown as an upward sloping curve. The reason why it is upward sloping is because that existing firms will earn more profit, because the guy down here who is willing to sell his stuff for $0.5, $1.5, if he makes more and more, like he's so efficient at making the good that when the price suddenly shifts to, no, when the quantity shifts to 3,000, and he's like, oh, I can make more and make even more money. But also, as more firms enter the market, as they see, oh, here's some place, because I'm not as efficient, but when the price is high enough, I am efficient enough to cover my costs, then I can enter the market, and hence the supply will increase. The law of supply states that there's a direct relationship between price of a good and quantity demanded. This is mathematically expressed as quantity supplied is the C, which is the supply at $0, or like when it crosses the curve here. Oh no, yeah, whatever. When the quantity is 0, that's the price, and then this is the gradient of the curve. Supply also has non-price determinants. These are mostly changes in cost of production. That's saying if something costs more to make, then you need to increase your price per unit to stay in business. And if it costs less, you may decrease the price and maybe sell more of that good and make more profit. Something that influences the cost of production are cost of raw materials, minimum wages, government intervention, and technology, which increases efficiency, or for example, technology will increase the efficiency of the production, and the cost of raw material, minimum wage, or government intervention such as taxes or subsidies changes the cost of production directly. So here you can see a shift in the supply curve. Make sure when you draw this on your exams that you label it correctly, which is price and then quantity, and then you should always have a title of what the good is. So when the market is in equilibrium, that is when supply and demand meet. There are no inefficiencies present, since those who are prepared to pay and supply at P equilibrium get what they want, so that these people down here are not willing or able to pay a price PE for their good, therefore they should not get the good. Same here, they don't want to supply as much here because they won't make enough profit, so then they shouldn't do it at all. So it's an equilibrium in the center here, and you can solve this on your paper 3s by setting the function for quantity demanded equals to quantity supplied. Then you can solve for the equilibrium price, and once you have that price, you can substitute that into whichever of these to find the quantity. Okay, so yeah, are there any questions? Just write them out in the chat. No sound? What? Stop baiting me. Doesn't matter. I take that as there are no questions. Therefore, I will continue till the next topic, which are elasticities. Alright, so we have something called price elasticity of demand, or PED. This is a measure of the responsiveness of demand to a change in price. This can be mathematically expressed as the percentage change in quantity demanded over the percentage change in price. And you should always neglect the minus sign in the final answer, at least when it comes to PED calculations. So if the PED is more than 1, then it's elastic, which means that if the price changed a bit, then the quantity demanded will change a disproportionately amount more, change. And then if it's inelastic, then that's the opposite. That's if the price changes by a lot, then the quantity demanded might not change as much. No, in microeconomics, we don't talk about crowding out. That's a part of macroeconomics, which we'll talk about tomorrow. Yeah, so here this shows an inelastic curve. It's very steep, and you can see that the box of the change in price is larger than the change in quantity demanded. And here's an elastic curve. This shows that for a small change in price, this box here, there's a lot larger change in the box of quantity demanded. There are also some special cases that you have to know. If PED goes to infinity, that means that it's perfectly elastic. That means that any change in price will lead to a pretty much indefinitely change in quantity demanded, or you can say that there will be no quantity demanded at all. Just as you can see here, even if the price goes down just a little bit, then there won't be any demand at all. It can also be unit elastic, which is here, which is that it's not really responsive at all. That means that the changes are equal at all points. And then we have PED equals 0, which is that it's perfectly inelastic, and then at any price, quantity demanded will remain unchanged. So the quantity demanded is a vertical line, and it will not change with the price. There are some determinants of PED. For example, the closeness of substitutes. For example, if you have Coke and Pepsi, if Coke decides to increase their prices by $1, then people are going to buy Pepsi. So it's more responsive to a change in price. The Coke, that is. And also the Pepsi if Coke suddenly increases prices or changes them. Fruits are, you don't find, for example, you can't replace apples with something else. Maybe you could say that, oh yeah, pears are almost the same, but no, they're not. So therefore fruits are inelastic, since that people will still want apples and there are only one type of apples. Then it also depends on the necessity of the good. For example, medicine, people will need their medicine, and if the change in price is high, then people will still have to buy their medicine because they can't live without it, for example, if they have some liver issues or whatever. So therefore it's inelastic, which you can see here, it's inelastic. And then the time period, how long does it take to change from, for example, the Apple ecosystem to, I don't know, Android? Some people are not willing to spend the time to change, and therefore they will not change. So then it's more of a inelastic curve, demand curve. Same goes for the cost of switching. If suddenly gas-powered cars went up in price, or for example the fuel went up in price, and many people have gas-powered cars, yeah, you could say that the type of apples, there are different type of apples, but apple as a good in its own is inelastic. But for example, Granny Smith apples or some other brand of apples, they're elastic, which is shown in the perfect competition topic. So when we're talking about substitutes or complements, then we can also measure this using the cross price elasticity of demand, XED, which is a measure of the responsiveness of a quantity demanded of a good X to a change in the price of good Y, which you can see mathematically expressed here. So and here you cannot neglect the minus sign, keep that in mind. So if XED is more than 0, that means that the goods are substitutes. And if it's a lot more than 0, then they're close substitutes. And if the XED is less than 0, then the goods are complements. And if it's a lot less than 0, then the goods are very close complements. For example, McDonald's burgers and their soda. And substitutes, you can say Coke or Pepsi. And if XED is 0, then the goods are unrelated, which means that whatever change happens to the good Y or good X, then there will be no change in the demand for either of them, or they have no relationship. Then we have the income elasticity, which is a measure of the responsiveness of a good to a change in income. This is expressed as YED. equals percentage change in quantity demanded of a good over the percentage change in an income. So if YD is more than 0, that means that it's a normal good, which means that as income rises, the quantity demanded will also rise. And if the income elasticity is less than 0, then they're inferior goods, which means that the quantity demanded goes down with a change in income. And this is shown here by the angle curve, which shows that, for example, potatoes are used here. So as income rises to a certain extent, people will buy more and more potatoes, and then it's going to plateau, and then it's going to decrease once people earn a lot more, because then they might think, oh, I can buy some fancy rice or pasta or whatever and stop buying these cheap potatoes. I have not seen them ask about the angle curve, but you can mention it if you want to on the paper one. What the value is a log greater? I'm not really sure if it's a log greater, or like what the value can be a log greater, but say if it's 1000 here, then there are obviously close substitutes, and if it's minus 1000 here, then there are obviously close complements. The last part of this is the price elasticity of supply, PES. This is a measure of the responsiveness of supply to a change in price. This is almost the same as price elasticity of demand, although we're talking about supply. I think I have to go all of these because we went through them as PD. They also have some non-price determinants. For example, the nature of the good. Primary goods, such as oil, take a lot of time to make. For example, if the demand for oil skyrocketed, or like no, the price for oil went up a lot, then it's going to be hard to start searching for new places to find oil under the ocean. While if you're making toothpicks, then it's pretty easy for you to start making more toothpicks because they are manufactured goods and you have almost instant access to raw materials. And this also depends on the ability to store stock. For example, oil can be responsive if they are storing a lot of stock. For example, if they have big ass tanks with oil, so when the price goes up, they will start emptying those tanks to respond to the market price. And spare capacity, which is almost the same as these, and the mobility of the factors of production. For example, if you're a company that makes longboards and skateboards, and then suddenly the price for skateboards went up a lot, and then you can stop making longboards and begin making skateboards a lot faster, since they're technically the same good. While if you, for example, growing apples and making go-karts, then it's really hard for you to change the good that you're prioritizing to produce. Then we have government intervention. Are there any questions for the elasticities part? Perfectly elastic, yeah. They are goods that make, for example, apples. They are in perfect competition, it's called. And that's because the companies making apples, they are no real way for them to make their apples different from others, and therefore if the price for your apple suddenly goes up by $1, then people will just buy apples from somebody else. Okay. Next is government intervention. So a form of intervention is indirect tax. Hold on, let me check if I'm recording. Yes, I am. The definition of an indirect tax is a tax is that a government levy on the sale of a good or a service issued to discourage behavior or production. So there are two types. There's a specific tax, which is a fixed amount, for example, $1. And when you draw your tax curves, you will see that the price and then the quantity here, and then you have to have some label of the market on your paper ones, and then you will shift the curve vertically upwards by the amount of the tax. On paper 1 they are not too anal about it being to scale, but on paper 3 they will ask you to change it exactly $1, but you will get like a net here and stuff, but like a grid. Then I have a ad valorem tax, which is a percentage amount, so that as the price increases, the tax also increases, which is shown as a curve that has a steeper slope than the supply curve, shifting upwards. There are some inefficiencies due to taxation. People who were getting the good they wanted before no longer does, and this is what you may call deadweight loss. So here they were making, or the market equilibrium was at Q1 and P1, but since they added the tax, it's now at P2 and Q2. So all these people here, the consumers were buying these goods, and here the producers were supplying. So there's a loss of their surplus. And when they ask about this in paper ones, you have to analyze the stakeholders. How are they affected? For example, here producers will lose revenue as they can't produce as much as they did before, and so they can't make as much as they did before. And the government here, of course, they are well off because they are making a revenue on this tax. They're making this revenue box here. No, they're making this, sorry, this entire box, this is the tax. And consumers, they are also losing because they cannot buy the good that they wanted. Although you could evaluate this to say that, oh, but if the good is bad for the consumers themselves, then the government is sort of saving them. And this is also dependent on the price elasticity of demand. For example, if the demand curve is inelastic, then the consumers will pay most of the tax since they are the most dependent on it, I guess you could say, while the producers don't pay as much. And if the demand curve is elastic, then the producers pay more, as they will just stop buying the good and go somewhere else, the consumers. Subsidies, that's a per unit payment to a firm granted by the government, and it's usually issued to encourage behavior. And when you draw this on your exams, then you will of course draw a curve shifting downwards by the amount of the subsidy. Keep in mind that you have to of course draw the supply curve because they are the ones who are directly affected by this. Then you of course have to analyze the stakeholders here. For example, it's expensive for the government to keep paying $2 per unit sold all the time, which may cause them to spend less money on, for example, healthcare or schooling, and they have less money available to spend on other subsidies. Consumers are better off here since they are getting the more goods for cheaper, although this also depends if it's a merit or demerit good. And then producers are better off because they're earning more revenue. You can analyze this with PED, saying that if the demand is inelastic, then the subsidy will have a low effect, since the change in demand will not be as big as it would have been if the demand curve was more elastic. Another way the government can intervene is through the use of price floors, which is a government set minimum price in the economy. This is shown here as P-min. This is usually set above the market equilibrium, since that's only when it has an effect. An example of this is minimum wage. For example, if you were to draw a wage diagram, which you can on the exam, you will label this the price of labor or cost of labor and the quantity of labor. So this causes inefficiencies. As you can see, suppliers now get signals that, okay, we are getting a payment, so we should make more goods. And then they do make more goods, but the customers don't want to buy as many goods. They only want to buy a Q1 amount of goods. And so there's an excess supply, which means that they're essentially wasting their factors of production. So to assure, and also what may happen is that these may begin to start having large sales or something, which will undercut this minimum price. And the government doesn't want this, so they might step in and start buying out the excess supply, which will shift the demand curve out, and it will cancel this excess supply area while keeping it at the minimum price. Although, of course, you could evaluate this and say that this is expensive for the government, and this yada yada yada, this will have an effect on stakeholders and stuff like that. They can also set price ceilings. This is a government set maximum price, and it's usually issued to protect consumers. For example, they can set a price ceiling on medicine, which tend to be really expensive, but consumers need these medicines, or rent, as people need somewhere to live, and sometimes the rent can skyrocket in the market. Although this leads to an inefficiency, demand is a lot greater than supply, as you can see here by the excess demand. This is also called a shortage. To ensure that the consumption happens on Q2, the government may step in and subsidize it, which will shift the supply out as the factors of production are cheaper, which will then meet the demands of the market. Okay, are there any questions? I'll take that as a no. And I can share the PowerPoint after the presentation. Okay, so market failure. This is topic 1.4, and a market failure is defined, or a market failure exists when the price mechanism fails to allocate resources at the socially optimal level, which is that the social cost is the same as the social benefit. So then this brings up the idea of externalities, which is the idea that there are external costs or benefits of an economic transaction, or spillover effects. An example of this is the oversupply of demerit goods, where demerit goods are goods that cause negative externalities, for example, cigarettes and alcohol, or a undersupply of merit goods, where merit goods are goods that cause positive externalities, for example, solar panels or gym memberships. When you're drawing diagrams for externalities in production, you will change the sort of supply side curve of this, which is the social cost and private cost. So here is a negative externality. Here they are producing paint, it seems, and the production of paint may be harming the environment, so that the social costs are higher than the costs of making the good. And this is not desirable. So as you can see in here, there's a welfare loss. Also, when you're shading this area, usually you can think of when it's a loss, then this will be like an arrow that points inwards, and when it's a gain, then it will point outwards. So the government can fix this situation by, for example, issuing a tax, taxing the producers of the good. This will shift the private cost curve, or the supply curve, upwards,
which will minimize the welfare loss. And you could evaluate this to say that this is only possible if you have perfect information, and the government, so to speak, never have that. So they might overshoot it or undershoot it, and that will cause inefficiencies on its own. Then we have positive externalities. For example, firms that offer training. So for example, this firm might be training people on how to print stuff. So here you can see that the social costs are lower than the private costs, which means that the overall costs could be a lot lower if you were making more at the Q star, which is then showed by the welfare gain area. And the government could fix this by, for example, subsidizing, or which would shift this curve down, which will increase the output of that firm. Also, imperfect information. The government doesn't have the diagrams exactly. They have to sort of do some guesswork, and so they might overshoot it and tax them way more than they should have done, which will cause welfare gains, or potential welfare gains. If this is up here, then there will be a gain area down here, and then they might tax them too little, which actually happened here, which will show that there is still some welfare loss in the economy. Hope that clarifies it. There are also externalities in consumption, and when you draw this, you manipulate the benefits curves. So that's the social benefits or the private benefits. So for example, a good that is a demerit good, for example cigarettes, that they cause negative externalities, that this shows that the private benefits of smoking cigars are greater than the social benefits. So there's a negative externality here, and this is again signified by the welfare loss. The government could then fix this by taxing the production of cigars, since this will shift the equilibrium position in the market, and which may move the quantity, the equilibrium quantity to Q star. As seen here, this is the optimum point, so the tax may move it up to Q star. Another thing they can do is to try to change the demand side by, for example, changing the public opinion of smoking cigarettes, which you will probably have seen on the cigarette packs, where there are big signs that says smoking kills you. Positive externalities may also occur, for example, with healthcare. That's a merit good because it causes a positive externality. Or maybe schooling is a better example. So that the private benefits of going to school is lower than the social benefits, or the social benefits are higher, which again signifies that there is a potential gain. The government can, for example, fix this because they want to move back to Q star, because that's the optimum point. They might subsidize schooling, for example, if your country only has private schools or something. Then the new equilibrium point will be on Q star. The last thing is that there are public goods. They are also seen as market failures. The definition of a public good is a good that exerts positive externalities and follow the characteristics of being non-rivalrous, which means that no one can use up the good. For example, if you're buying Pepsi, then if you buy a can of Pepsi, then the supply of Pepsi cans will be one less. Well, this is not the case for public goods. And they're also non-excludable, which means that everyone can benefit from these goods, which then causes the free rider problem, that people who doesn't even pay for it may be able to benefit from it. So this causes private firms to be extremely unlikely to want to supply this good. But you cannot say that public goods are goods that are provided by the government on your exam, because they will not give you marks for this. And this will absolutely kill you, and you will drop down on a lot of marks if you miss this basic definition. Yes, it is usually provided by the government, but it's not the meaning of public good, at least in this syllabus. Why is this a market failure? It's because the price mechanism in the economy fails to allocate the resources to the socially optimum level, so that the government has to step in and supply these goods because the private market does not want to. All right, that's it for today. So tomorrow it's at 1300 GMT. We'll talk about macroeconomics. And again, Wednesday is international economics, and then on Thursday we're talking about theory of the firm, and we might go through some mock paper 3s. All right, thank you.